We are now down to session number 8 as we move ahead in this distance learning course on an introduction to Islam. Session 8 focuses on Islam as a culture. The temptation is to think solely of Islam as a religious system, a matter of beliefs and practices that have primarily to do with one's relationship with God and center on matters of the community pulled together in the mosque, in prayer, and in related kinds of activities. But in fact, Islam is a holistic system. It touches every area of life, and it is as much a culture, a way of life, a worldview, as it is a religious system. So this is what we want to look at and think about some today. But to do that, we want to take a step back and begin by simply talking about culture, trying to give some sort of a definition to it, and then reflecting very quickly on a model or two. Culture has been defined in dozens and dozens of ways by cultural anthropologists and other sociologists and social scientists who have been concerned with the way human beings interact with one another. For our purposes, it basically is an integrated system by which people see relationships with one another, with the physical universe, and with the unseen world. In any given culture, there is both the explicit and the implicit. The explicit has to do with that which is easily observable and which is objective in its nature and consciously learned. The implicit has to do with that which is generally unseen. Somehow it is learned simply by a process of osmosis. We enter into the values and the perspectives of a culture without even being conscious that this is taking place. The analogy that has often been used, and in your material you will find a link that will allow you to bring up a chart. It's simply identified as iceberg. The analogy that has been used is that of an iceberg. You have seen pictures of icebergs and know that the vast majority of an iceberg is hidden beneath the surface of the water. This is true of cultures. This is the reason the iceberg analogy seems to work so well. Above the water, you basically see the behaviors of people, but hidden in the waves and below the waves are the beliefs that animate those behaviors and the assumptions that lead to those beliefs, the values that people hold dear, and what is called the worldview, the ultimate assumptions they make about life. A worldview has to do with the question of what's really real. Is there really a God or not? What is the ultimate thing that exists in the universe? It has to do with the fundamental nature of humankind and the universe, with people's concept of time and history and morality, and their understanding of life and death and what takes place beyond death. These things, at least in terms of their theoretical assumptions, are generally hidden within a culture. These are the things that you and I come to hold as a part of our culture without having to consciously study them. We're simply brought up in that kind of a context. Another way to think about a culture would be to think about a target, a bullseye, as it were, that one might shoot at with a rifle or a bow and arrow. Thus, immediately you think of a circle and a circle in the circle, and another circle in that, and finally down to the center circle, the bullseye. There is a link in which you can pull up a chart that illustrates this. It simply is labeled target. At the very center ring is that which is the worldview. what is really real. In the next circle out is that which is true, or the belief system of a people. Beyond that is the circle that says what is the good or the best. This is a matter of the values that interact with the belief system and are shaped by it. The next circle out involves the behaviors of people, and then there could even be a circle beyond that that would simply be labeled products. The things that that culture produces, tangible things like chairs and houses and automobiles and books, all of which somehow reflect the behaviors of people and grow out of the values and the beliefs of people. This is a simple kind of model for any culture. Now we can simply step over into the Islamic world and say, in the case of Islam, a similar kind of pattern, at least in terms of categories, is there to be looked at, to be studied, to be observed. In the case of the Muslim world, at the very central circle, the worldview, there are assumptions about the existence of God, the God of Islam, who we have discovered is known as Allah. Beyond that, there is the sense that this God has revealed. He has given the Quran. He has sent down His message. And thus, the Muslim approach to life and the Muslim understanding of the arrangement of life is rooted in the sense that God has put it all together. So the universe is ordered. It's ordered by God. And in turn, what people think, what they value, and the basic assumptions they make about life are likewise to be rooted in this central concept of a God who has set forth the order that He has arranged. Out of this, then, come the beliefs and the values that animate the Muslim's life. And those beliefs and values, in turn, give shape to the way people behave. Once again, there is a link in your material in which you can bring up a chart that demonstrates something of the holism of an Islamic approach to life. It is labeled Ummah, U-M-M-A, which is the Muslim word or the Arabic word for community, and hence a label for the way society in an Islamic setting is structured and organized if people are taking Islam seriously. Admittedly, sometimes they do not. But as you look at that particular chart, you will see different segments of life. Those areas that involve education, others that are devoted to economics, the arts, those things that have to do with government and law, areas that have to do with recreation, social interaction, the family as an entity and how it is understood. And one of the wedges in this particular diagram, as you look at it, has to do with religious practice. Now, for us in the West, given our cultural orientation that tends to separate the sacred and the secular, when we think of Islam and an Islamic setting and an Islamic culture, we tend to focus on religious practice. The mosque, what it is, the functions it serves, who goes there, when people come together, rather like thinking about Christians going to church. When is church conducted? What is a church building like? What happens in the building? Who are the functionaries that lead in that activity? And so forth. And so the temptation is to center our thoughts solely on Islamic prayer practices, practices of fasting, theological reflection as it relates to questions of God and sin and salvation. The ultimate assumption being, having looked at this section labeled religious practice, that we have considered the whole, the essence of Islam. But since Islam is a culture as well as a religion, we can't stop there. Because you see, as you note the chart, growing out of that center circle, the worldview, are influences that reach out into every other wedge in this circle, into economics, into society, into family, into government and law, into arts, into recreation, any other kind of category that you might care to put in there. And each of those realms is as much a part of Islam as religious practice. And just as religious practice for the Muslim is defined by who God is and the instructions that God has sent down, so economic behavior, family life, what is done in the name of recreation or the arts that are authorized, these things likewise are a product of God's divinely ordered way for human beings. This is a way of looking at life that is very different from the way the average Westerner considers life. Unfortunately, this is a different way of viewing life than most Christians do. Now, we could say as Christians, in reality, at the center of a circle ought to be God, Jesus, God's revelation in the Bible, and in turn, that information ought to reach out to influence every dimension of life. How we live as families, how government is carried on, how education is handled, what we do in terms of arts and recreation, how politics unfolds, the economic principles of life. And yet we know that often in the modern evangelical world, those things are simply considered outside the parameters of biblical concerns. And they somehow are relegated to the secular realm and left for other people to deal with, while we as Christians would focus on religious practices and relationships of people with each other in the context of church and morality, as well as in the context of a relationship with God. Basically, what I'm trying to say to you is that sometimes it is a struggle for us to shift in our perspective in order to appreciate the totality, the wholeness, the completeness of an Islamic culture. And yet, if we're going to minister to Muslims effectively, we're going to have to be able and willing to make that kind of shift, to appreciate what's going on with them. Now, as we think about this, one of the things that we have to consider has to do with the basic cultural values that characterize us as Americans. Values that permeate our lives both as individuals and that enter even into the ministry that we engage in. Again, in the materials that you have, there is a link labeled American Cultural Values. You can click on that link and bring up a chart that is a summary of the things that I want to say to you at this time. What are some of the basic American cultural values that typically are a part of our society? Now, you might be thinking, well, why don't we talk about Christian cultural values? And indeed, that would be important for us to do. But what I want to suggest to you is that frequently, simply because we live in the culture that we live in, we have breathed in and made part of our lives those cultural values that are typical of our whole society. And we often are unconscious of those values, and yet those very values give shape to the way we live life, to the way we think of the gospel, and to the way that we carry on ministry. Here are some of those values. There is the value of freedom. That is, freedom in the sense of individualism. My right to be me. My right to do what I want to do, to think what I want to think, to go where I want to go. In our society, we would find people immediately rebelling if the idea was set forth that someone else ought to choose your life's vocation for you. Someone else can dictate where you would go to a university. Oh, and above all, that someone else would have the right to choose your life's mate, your husband or wife, for you. No, those are rights that belong to us, and we guard them with a great deal of jealousy. Now, this is not to say they're wrong. It is simply to say that they are our values, and they may contrast rather radically with the values of some other peoples in the world. They give shape even to the way that we read the Bible. An example. When we read the Apostle Paul, Paul frequently uses the word you, Y-O-U. Inevitably, when we read Paul and read the word you, we tend to read it as you singular, as if Paul is speaking to me as an individual. But usually Paul does not speak in the singular. Paul is a Hebrew. Paul comes out of a context where there is an emphasis upon community and group. And generally, he is saying you, plural, you as a congregation, you as a community of believers. The Philippian passage, he who has begun a good work in you will bring it unto completion at the day of Christ. How many times do we hear a verse like that? The you in that passage is plural. It has very little to do with what God is doing within me as an individual, but rather it has to do with what God is doing within us as a group of believers in a given setting. This is simply the way our culture influences us. It causes us to almost automatically interpret words in a certain way that reflect the values that permeate our lives. Again, in terms of our values often involve twofold judgment and moralizing. Now, what that means is simply that as we look at things very simplistically. We look at things and they are good, they are bad, they're right, they're wrong, they're true, they're false. If people begin to talk about shades of gray, then this makes us, many times, very nervous. We want things to be very clear-cut, right or wrong, yes or no. No equivocating about things, no talking around issues and dealing with ambivalence. Life is clear and plain and simple. But that is not the case for multitudes of people in the world. There are times and places and circumstances when the choice is not between yes or no or good or bad, but sometimes the choice is between the better and the best, or the bad and the worst. Sometimes there is no good choice, but a choice has to be made nonetheless. The moralizing comes in the terms that we use. The terms good, bad, right, wrong, true, false are moral terms. They are not neutral. They carry with them a sense of judgment. This is simply a part of our culture. This is who we are. Again, in our society, time is money. It is a commodity. In fact, it's terribly difficult for us to speak of it in with any other kind of terms. How are you spending your time? If you would do these things, you would save half a day. And so we see that just the way we form sentences reinforces the idea that time is money, that time is a commodity. In many other cultures in the world, time is simply not viewed that way. Ours is a culture that emphasizes effort and optimism. Now, what that simply means is that theoretically, you can be whatever you want to be. Abraham Lincoln, the old tradition goes, was born in a log cabin, and yet he became president. In the same way, if you are willing to put forth the effort, you can accomplish anything that you want to accomplish. In other parts of the world, people aren't so sure of that. And that sense of applying oneself in order to achieve, and that sense of optimism that anything is possible, simply is not there with them. Ours is a society that lays a great deal of value on progress and change. The assumption is that next year's automobiles will be better than this year's automobiles. And the commitment to changing things seems to be deeply rooted, at least in many segments of our society. There are other societies that are not so sure that progress is possible and that resist change because the old is the best from their perspective. Ours is a society that lays emphasis on equality. One person, one vote, so to speak. Now, in reality, it may not work out that way for many people, but nonetheless, this is an assumed value. Material well-being is another. You know that one is successful on the basis of what they have accumulated materially. The size of their car, the size of their house, the size of their salary, the size of their stock portfolio. Material well-being. We are a people who have a great deal of value that is placed on efficiency. In a sense, we're the microwave people of the world. Get it done, and get it done quickly. And in conjunction with that, another value is directness. Don't talk around and around and around the thing. Come to the point. Get to the bottom line. Other societies do not have that value of efficiency and directness that we have. And sometimes that throws us into considerable conflict as we begin to attempt to minister in those settings. We are a society that values competition. Look at children. Almost from the time they're knee-high, out participating in sports, pushed along with the idea that they need to excel. We are a society that lays a great deal of emphasis on youth. Look at our churches. Most value a youth minister. Few have a minister to old people. And if there's a choice to be made between the two, the church will inevitably go in the direction of youth. Now, this is, again, not to say that this is improper, but it is to say it probably is more of a reflection of the values of our society than it is anything else. Well, you get something of the idea. American cultural values and the way they impact our lives. Now I have an assignment for you. You will need to hit the pause button in just a moment, and you will go to a link entitled Silly Confusion. Strange name. SILICONFUSION. And this will take you to an Islamic website where you will learn something about Islam in terms of its social dynamics and the conduct and behavior of people. I want you to reflect on the standards of conduct that are set forth in the material that you will find and read there. And then I want you to post those reflections back to me. So, at this time, if you'll hit the pause button. As we go on then, we want to look specifically now at some Islamic values. And again, there is a chart that you can bring up that lists these for you. I'm simply going to work through these with you. It is entitled Islamic Values. The first that you will see is groupness. That is, within a Muslim context, there's a great deal of emphasis on the importance of the group. The group in this case being the extended family. Now this is different from our nuclear family approach to life. In our country, generally we think of a father and a mother and maybe one child, at most two, in the average situation. And that's the family. And beyond that, there is little connectedness. I am an only child. I grew up in a family where my mother was one of 8 children. Her brothers and sisters were scattered all over the United States. They obviously are my aunts and uncles. I never knew those people. And if you said to me at this moment, name your aunts and uncles on your mother's side, I would say, give me a minute. Let me think about this. I could do it. But if you asked me, name your cousins on your mother's side, the children of your aunts and uncles, I would say, well, there's no use even trying. I'm certain I can't do that. I can get only a few. The point is, I come from a family setting where there never was a serious connectedness in terms of the extended family. And that is typical of so many American situations. In a Muslim setting, however, the family, the extended family, is at the heart and the core of life and social structure. It is the most important institution that exists. This is a cultural phenomenon. Now, within that group or within that family, there are certain dynamics that take place. First of all, that particular group is hierarchical in nature. That is, it's rather like a pyramid. And at the top of the pyramid are the older men, the father and his brothers. These are the power brokers within the group. And then the next levels down consist of the sons of these men. And they occupy different levels coming down the pyramid depending upon whether they are the firstborn, the secondborn, the lastborn in terms of sons. The next level down under them are the women, the older women. And they likewise then move from the older women to the younger women to the girls who are not yet married. This is sort of the pyramidal structure of a typical Muslim family. It is hierarchical. It is male-dominated. That is, when it comes to important decisions to be made in the family that affect the larger family and its ultimate well-being, those decisions finally will be made through the consensus of the older men. In this family kind of structure, everyone has a fixed role. For example, the firstborn son of necessity is the right arm or the chief lieutenant of his father. The family may decide to pool its money and to send a son to London or to Harvard in order to get an education, with the hope that then with that education the son will get a good job and in turn money will flow back to the family. But the family will never send the firstborn son, because the firstborn son is the heir apparent to the father's position. And he needs to stay with the father to know the family business, and to be in the position to step in with as much information as possible into the role of leadership when the father is no longer on the scene. There is a fixed role for him. There is unequal access. This simply means that the younger sons, if they wish to access the father and get his ear, in typical situations, will go through the firstborn son. They simply do not come to Dad and say, Pop, I've got a problem. Let me tell you about this kind of situation. You see, the family is structured in very rigid kinds of ways in many situations. Someone has used the analogy of a fishing net, a seine. You can imagine a seine that you might drag through a river or a pond in order to try to catch minnows or other small fish. The seine is made up of a multitude of strings that interconnect with one another. And each place, a vertical string and a horizontal string come together, there is a knot, a piece of string that ties those together so that things are kept in the proper weave or web in order to allow the net to be a net and to work. Without that knot, the string would slip. The net would not function as a net. All right, the point of this is at this point. Those who have looked at the typical Muslim kind of family have said the individual is like a knot in a fishing net. Now what this means is that the individual becomes subsumed under the wish, the desire, the function of the larger group. You never look at a fishing net and say, my, that's a wonderful knot over there on the right side, 6 down and 5 in. What a magnificent knot that holds those two strings together. But rather you look at the net and say, it looks like you have a good net. And in a Muslim context, people look at a family and say, this is a good family. It's functioning in an appropriate way. The individual, for the most part, loses the right to the kind of individualism and freedom of desire and action that characterizes us. Now, what does this say to ministry in this kind of a setting? Well, you can well imagine. In our context, we approach individuals. You're free. Why worry about your parents? Come and believe what you want. Go where you want. Do what you want. Embrace Jesus. You cannot be concerned about others. But in this group setting, it is not so easy for one to act independently. And in fact, in our ministry, if we begin with the young, we somehow ensure that we will fail. Because the real decision makers that affect the possibility of future action for individuals, the real decision makers are the older men. Thus, we must come up with a strategy that will move us from the younger to the older, eventually to the firstborn son and to the father. And if we're dealing with women, from the younger women to the older women to the mother, who is a kind of power broker within the female domain within the family. Islam is a culture, and we have to deal with it as such. Again, in thinking of Muslim values, there is the importance of hospitality. Hospitality figures very significantly both in the Old Testament and in the New Testament. There are some interesting stories that we could look at that demonstrate hospitality in action. Back in the book of Genesis, Abraham welcoming the 3 men who turned out to be angels, where the conversation takes place about Sodom and will the city be spared if there are only so many righteous people in it. It's interesting, the hospitality that is exercised there. When these people arrive, Abraham welcomes them. He invites them to stay. He sends instructions for the killing of an animal, for the getting of a certain amount of flour and the kneading of bread, and eventually the provision of food. Have you ever thought how long those guys had to wait to eat? It was hour upon hour upon hour. But in a Middle Eastern setting, as in a Muslim setting today, that is insignificant, because what is going on is the process of hospitality and human interaction around food, even though the food may be a long time in coming. As we interact with Muslims, it becomes important for us to understand how their culture shapes the sense of hospitality. And if we're going to be hospitable to them, we need to do it in ways that they understand, not just in ways that we understand and approve of. A great deal more could be said about this. You might pursue it sometime in a book called Touching the Soul of Islam, written by a man named Bill Musk, M-U-S-K. But hospitality is another value. Time is yet another value. Time in the sense of relationship. Muslims anticipate that if you're going to really show them respect and really come into some sort of connectedness with them, that you're going to have to spend time. This is not something that can happen quickly. Again, we struggle with our American efficiency. Meet, talk, split, go our way. But from the Muslim perspective, like with hospitality, time becomes something that involves a great deal of effort. And in fact, unless we are spending discretionary time with the Muslim, we're really not spending time with them. The fact that we sit in a classroom together, that's not time spent together. The fact that we ride in a taxi together, that is not really time spent together. It's leisure time, when we just kick back, relax, and talk over a prolonged period. And often the talk seems to be going nowhere. That is, it's about all sorts of things that might ultimately appear to be trivialities. And yet out of this, there is the building of a bond, of credibility, of the opportunity then to be heard in some things that are more important to us and that we want to be more important to the Muslim. Another value that we can touch on is the place, the value of honor. In an Islamic setting, honor is, in effect, the central driving value that gives shape to everything else. The backside of honor is shame. Shame is the loss of honor. Honor is the avoidance of shame. Honor in an Islamic setting is both a code for interpretation and for action. A code for interpretation is a screen through which people look at what is being said and done and decide this is acceptable or unacceptable. A code for behavior is that which then says, how shall I respond? I shall do this which is honorable, I shall avoid that which is shameful. Thus, it is both a cognitive process, it has emotional dimensions to it, and it spills out in pragmatic action. It involves a system of symbols at the cognitive level, values that are held, definitions that are set forth. At the pragmatic level, it guides and motivates what one does in response to things that have been done to you. It is associated in the Muslim's mind with generosity, honesty, sincerity, loyalty to friends, keeping one's word, fearlessness, strength, and self-control. Thus, it turns out to be something connected with a multitude of other things. Honor is pervasive. That is, it is found at all levels of society. It is the overriding social obligation. It is that which above all else one must do, the honorable thing. It is as valuable as any material benefit, so that the Muslim is willing to lose all sorts of material things in order to protect and to preserve his or her honor. In terms of some of the details of the operation of honor, honor is one's reputation in the eyes of others. It has nothing to do particularly with my own reputation in my own eyes. It's not what I think of me. It's not what God thinks of me. It's what others think of me. And it is inseparable from the group. Honor is never a case of my honor alone, but it always involves the group's honor. And I am a part of that group and hence caught up in the honor issues that affect and animate it. It touches on self-esteem. There's no question about that. In terms of how I feel about myself. In an honor setting, appearances are substance. Now that simply means that you do, you say, you act in the way that will convey respect for others, whether you feel like that or not. At a very practical level, it's not uncommon in a Muslim setting for someone to be invited to come to one's home for a meal. And in the process of that invitation, the individual accepts because he somehow feels pressured by the way the invitation is offered. When the time comes, the individual does not show up. What's happened? Well, they have simply done the honorable thing at the moment. I have invited you. It would be a shame for you to decline. It would be showing disrespect to me for you to decline. And so you accept, sometimes knowing full well that you will not appear. The next time I see you, I say, we waited on you, we missed you. And the answer may be something like, well, a relative died. And I know, if I understand the honor system, that one's obligation to a relative takes precedence over one's obligation to me as a stranger and an invitation to a meal. And so, even though you have not showed up, you have maintained honor, I have not been shamed, and I understand that you have done the honorable thing as you have reported to me that a relative has died. Now, maybe a relative died and maybe they did not. That, in a sense, is beyond the point. But the appearance is the substance of the transaction. In an honor system, all relationships are personal. Impartiality is impossible. To simply come along and say, well, don't take this personally. What I want to say to you or what I want to do, don't take this personally. There is no other way to take it. All honor societies take things personally, either in terms of enhancing their dignity or depriving them of something of the respect that they as a group believe is owed to them. In an honor setting, propriety involves a code of good manners. In other words, you do what is expected. You say what is expected. And what you are to do and what you are to say is defined by the culture. And thus you act in those ways. From our perspective, sometimes this may seem to be a bit deceptive. And yet in reality, it's not intended to be deceptive at all. It simply arises out of a different value system. In an honor context, there is no room for private emotion, but rather one displays emotion as is appropriate. On one occasion, a friend of mine in Libya received word that her husband had been injured in the oil field and was being flown back into the city for treatment. There were some Palestinian Muslim women present with her in her home when this occurred. As she reported this to them and excused herself needing to go meet her husband, they concluded that she did not really love her husband. And the reason for that was she was not overtly distraught. She was not pulling at her hair. She was not weeping and wailing. She was calmly getting herself together in order to get in the car and go to the hospital. She was concerned. She did have fear as to his condition and what the future might hold. But she was not expressing that in an overt way in the manner that Muslims were accustomed to. And so they interpreted her behavior in a specific way. Honor says that you learn to accommodate people, that you avoid rudeness, that you do not confront people directly. Bluntness somehow is anathema. Differences are not to be openly expressed. All of these things then govern the Muslim. How do they impact us when it comes to carrying on ministry? I have an assignment for you at this point. And that assignment would be for you to reflect on how taking honor seriously would have to alter the way you do ministry to Muslims. Think about the things we've just said and post that back to me. Incidentally, there is a link that you can go to called Honor that will bring up for you the list of honor items that I have simply enumerated for you at this particular time so that you can review them again and reflect upon them more seriously and more carefully. The point in all of this is that Islam is a culture. It has its values. Those values are not likely to yield themselves until and unless they come under the influence of the Holy Spirit. We cannot expect Muslims to act Christianly when they are not Christian. We have to minister to them within the cultural context where they are, taking seriously the values that characterize their lives. We have to identify the values that typically, unconsciously animate us and see the ways in which they conflict with, clash with the values of the Muslim, and then determine how we are going to make an adjustment. I have another assignment for you, and that is I would like for you to do a bit of reflection in which you compare and contrast Muslim values, as I've tried to describe them for you, with those values that are typically reflected in contemporary American television shows. You might look at a show like Once and Again, or Seinfeld, or Dharma and Greg, and ask yourselves, what are the values that are being portrayed there? What are the underlying assumptions about life reflected in those media productions? And how do they compare with, or how do they contrast with, what you find in a Muslim setting? I think you'll find this an interesting exercise. It relates to ministry. So happy thinking and happy searching until we're together again.